The most important tip when dealing with diagonal comparisons is to be very aware of the direct and indirect engagements that teams have with one another. This matters because, as judges, you need to be as fair as possible to both teams in the diagonal comparison, as the opening team does not get an explicit direct opportunity to respond to their closing. So rather than seeing this as an imbalance that has to be corrected by overweighting certain arguments or imposing unrealistic burdens on opening and closing teams, see this as an opportunity to critically evaluate what was already said and be as concrete as possible. Direct engagements include points of information, responses, and preemptions. It's important to track and take note of these, as these are the most obvious ways teams will attempt to beat out their diagonal team. You should ask yourself, what specific aspect of the argument is being put into question, and how does this specific response undermine the contribution of a particular team? So here it should be clear that you already know what is going on. Whether it is a POI, a direct rebuttal, or a preemption, or an attempt at a preemption, there is always an idea that is being flagged, an attempt at responding, and the explanation from the teams to the weighing of this particular response, or basically how much it matters in the debate. So these responses should be the most immediate things that judges should be hyper aware of before anything else. Indirect engagements, on the other hand, are more tricky. This matters because these teams are not able to dedicate an equivalent amount of time for direct response to one another. And yet there is still material that is presented by teams in a debate to be able to use as a justification for them to beat other teams. So this is no less important than direct engagements, as this all counts as existing analysis that is presented in a round. This includes implicit responses that pertain to how the constructive material of a team forwards a certain point that is to the detriment of other arguments in a round. For example, if a team presents significant reasons for a certain premise to be true, then they have presented an analysis that outweighs other potential competing characterizations. So if the closing team were to create an argument that requires this premise to be untrue, then of course you have to include this initial analysis from the opening as part of the existing engagement. Another indirect engagement would be responses that were initially directed towards the direct opposite horizontal teams. Just because a response from an opening team is directed towards another opening team does not mean that this response cannot apply to the closing team as well. It matters less to which the response is directed than the actual content of the analysis. And of course, it is part of your duty as a judge to assess to what extent this response may apply. It can be responses on the effectiveness of the model, the counterfactual, characterizations of actors, etc. And this also applies equally to closing teams. So watch out for these pathways of engagement as well, especially since diagonal engagements require that discipline. Alright, that's it for today's video. Thank you everyone.